The metallic clang of the locker door was the only sound that felt real. Zara traced the dent in the cheap tin, a small crater someone had left in a fit of pique years ago. She had always found it grounding, a tiny imperfection in the sterile, white and bleach world of the hospital. Now, it just felt like another piece of a life being slammed shut. Mr. Henderson's words echoed in the sudden quiet of the empty changing room, sour and self-satisfied. Insubordination. Reckless endangerment. Violation of hospital protocol, Section 4, subsection C. Your contract is terminated, effective immediately. Pack your things. He had practically vibrated with glee, his little bureaucratic heart swelling with the power to ruin. She had broken the rules. She knew it the moment she did it. The man on the gurney, pale and gasping, his skin clammy with a sweat that was too cold, wasn't responding to the standard treatment for acute poisoning. His vitals were plummeting in a way that defied the textbook. Zara had seen it once before during a specialized training rotation, a rare designer toxin that required an equally rare, experimental antidote the hospital kept locked away for extreme, board-approved cases only. There was no time for a board. There was no time for Henderson's paperwork. There was only the stuttering line on the heart monitor and the man's fading pulse beneath her fingers. So she had bypassed protocol, unlocked the refrigerated cabinet using a code she was not supposed to remember, and administered the injection. The man's heart rate had stabilized almost instantly. She had saved his life. And for that, she had lost her job. Her hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as she folded her spare set of scrubs. The fabric was worn soft, a familiar comfort she would no longer have. 22 years old, and she was already a pariah in the only profession she had ever wanted. A good nurse, a competent one, but with a black mark on her record that would follow her to every interview, every application. She could already picture the tight, polite smiles of future hiring managers. We admire your initiative, but we have other candidates whose records are cleaner. With a sigh, she slung her bag over her shoulder. The weight of it felt heavier than it had this morning. The walk out of the hospital was a gauntlet of ghosts. The emergency room doors hissed open, and the familiar cacophony of beeping machines, rushed voices, and the low groan of someone in pain washed over her. For 2 years, this chaos had been her sanctuary, the place where her skills mattered more than anything else. Now she was just a civilian passing through. She kept her eyes fixed on the glass doors of the main entrance, the promise of the cool night air a distant comfort. Henderson was waiting for her in the lobby, his arms crossed over his chest like a petty king guarding his castle gate. He had an unarmed security guard with him, a man named Frank who always saved Zara a donut on the night shift. Frank wouldn't meet her eyes. "Just making sure you find your way out, Ms. James," Henderson said, his voice slick with false concern. Zara ignored him, her gaze locked on the exit.
Just a few more steps.
Then this whole nightmare would be behind her. But the automatic doors slid open before she could reach them, and the entire atmosphere of the lobby shifted. The air grew still, heavy. The low hum of the vending machines and the distant television seemed to fall silent. 3 men entered. The 2 on the flanks were broad and silent, their dark suits doing little to hide the disciplined strength in their frames. They moved with an unnerving economy, their eyes scanning the room without seeming to look at anything at all. But it was the man in the center who commanded the space. He was tall, his posture ramrod straight, encased in a suit of such exquisite tailoring it seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin. It was charcoal gray, the fabric catching the harsh fluorescent light in a way that spoke of impossible expense. His black hair was expertly cut, every strand in place. He moved like the room owed him space, and the people in it instinctively gave it to him. Henderson, ever the fool, stepped forward. "Sir, visiting hours are over. If you have a medical emergency, please check in at the ER desk." The man didn't even glance at him. His eyes, dark and sharp as obsidian chips, swept the lobby and settled on Zara. They were intelligent eyes, analytical, and in their depths, she saw a coldness that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He started walking toward her. It was not a stroll, it was a trajectory. Sir, I must insist, Henderson began, puffing out his chest. One of the flanking men took a single, soft step forward.
He did not speak.
He did not gesture. He simply shifted his weight, and the implied violence was so absolute that Henderson's words died in his throat. The supervisor took an involuntary step back, his face paling. The man in the charcoal suit stopped directly in front of Zara. He was close enough that she could smell the subtle, clean scent of his cologne. Not a heavy musk, but something crisp and cool, like cedarwood after a rainstorm. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable, a mask of aristocratic calm. Zara's heart, which had been a dull, aching drum in her chest, began to beat a sharp, frantic rhythm. This was not a doctor. This was not a patient's grieving family member. This was danger in a bespoke suit. Then he spoke, and his voice was a low, smooth baritone, utterly devoid of accent, yet carrying a cadence that was not from around here. It was the kind of voice that never needed to be raised to be obeyed. "Ma'am," he said. The word was so unexpected, so formal and respectful, that it threw her off balance more than any threat could have. No one had called her ma'am in her life. It was always Zara or Nurse James or, "Hey you." He held her gaze. "Were you the nurse who attended to the man brought in by ambulance an hour ago? The one with the respiratory collapse?" Zara's throat was dry. She could only manage a single, tight nod. She thought of the patient, the strange poison, the antidote. This had to be about him. The man's eyes held hers for a beat longer, a silent assessment that felt as if it were peeling back layers of her skin to see the bones beneath. He seemed to find what he was looking for. "You're coming with me," he stated. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was a declaration of fact, as though the universe had already bent to his will and was merely waiting for her body to catch up.
What?
"No," Zara stammered, finding her voice. "I can't. I don't even know who you are." Henderson, recovering a sliver of his bravado, scurried forward. "She is no longer an employee of this hospital. You can't just, this is private property." The man didn't look at him. He didn't have to. His attention remained entirely on Zara, a focused, predatory stillness. "That is a matter between her and me," he said, his voice dropping half an octave, turning the lobby's air to ice. He took a step closer to Zara. "We can do this quietly, or we can cause a scene that you, Mr. Henderson, will not enjoy. The choice is yours." Before Zara could process the threat, before she could decide whether to scream or run, the man's hand closed around her upper arm. His touch was not rough, but it was inescapable. The strength in his fingers was immense, a calm, unyielding pressure that spoke of absolute control. Through the thin fabric of her jacket, his grip was a brand. "Let's go," he said, his voice for her ears only. He began to turn, pulling her with him. Zara stumbled, her bag bumping against her hip. She looked back at Henderson, whose face was a comical mask of fear and indignation. She looked at Frank, the security guard, who just stood there helpless. No one was coming to save her. No one was going to stop this. The automatic doors slid open again, welcoming them into the dark, waiting night. She was being taken, and the world she had known just minutes before, the sterile hallways, the locker with the dent, the life she had built, was already gone, as if it had never been hers at all. The car was a black sedan with windows so tinted they looked like polished obsidian. The interior was silent, swallowing the sounds of the city the moment the heavy door clicked shut. Zara found herself on a supple leather seat, the man who had taken her beside her, one of his silent soldiers in the passenger seat, the other driving. The car pulled away from the curb with a smooth, powerful glide that was as unnerving as its owner's movements. She could feel the man's presence beside her, a solid wall of heat and coiled energy. He wasn't touching her, but she felt pinned in place by his proximity. She stared out the window, watching the familiar streetlights of her neighborhood blur into streaks of gold and white. Her mind was racing, trying to catch up to the reality of her situation.
Kidnapped.
She had been kidnapped from her own workplace. Yet it didn't feel like the frantic, violent abductions from the movies. It was quiet, orderly, and terrifyingly efficient. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. She would not show him fear. She was a trauma nurse. She had faced down screaming, delirious patients and delivered devastating news to families. She could handle a man in a nice suit. He turned his head slightly, his profile carved in the dim light of the cabin. A strong jaw, a straight nose. He looked like a statue of a fallen prince. "To a place where you can finish the job you started," he said. "The patient," Zara breathed, understanding dawning. "The man I treated. Is he?" "He is alive."
For now, the man replied.
"Thanks to you. The doctors I have on my payroll were baffled.
They had never seen a compound like it.
But you recognized it," he paused, turning to face her fully.
How?
Zara's training kicked in, the part of her that analyzed and assessed. He wasn't asking out of idle curiosity. He was gathering intelligence. "I was part of a pilot program 2 years ago. We studied emergent biological and chemical threats. That toxin was in one of the case studies. A synthetic neurotoxin designed to mimic, then overwhelm, the body's acetylcholine receptors." She spoke the clinical language like a shield. "The hospital has the antidote, but it's restricted. I broke protocol to administer it." "You got fired for it," he stated, his eyes searching her face. Yes. A flicker of something, not quite surprise, more like confirmation, passed through his expression. "And you did it anyway." "He was dying," Zara said simply, as if that explained everything. To her it did. The car ascended a winding road into the hills overlooking the city, leaving the dense grid of lights below. They passed through a set of imposing iron gates and pulled up before a house that was less a house and more a monument of glass and steel cantilevered over the mountainside. It was stark, beautiful, and as cold as its owner. Inside, the silence was even more profound. The decor was minimalist to the point of being monastic. Black leather, polished chrome, dark wood floors. No photos, no clutter. Just space, and a panoramic view of the sprawling city lights through a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows. It was the home of a man who owned everything and cherished nothing. One of the soldiers led her down a hallway to a large room that had been converted into a makeshift ICU. Medical monitors and 4 stand and an oxygen tank were clustered around a king-sized bed. In the bed lay the man from the hospital. His name, the man in the suit had informed her, was Mr. Kim. He was breathing steadily now, but his face was still ashen. A man in a white coat, presumably one of the payroll doctors, stood by, looking nervous. "The antidote stabilized him, but his system is still fighting the residual effects," the doctor reported to the suit-clad man. "His blood pressure is fluctuating. We're managing it, but..." The man's gaze shifted to Zara. "The doctor believes a secondary reaction is possible. The toxin may have bonded with proteins in his blood in a way we don't understand. You administered the cure. You will stay and ensure it works." "I'm not a doctor," Zara said, her professionalism warring with her survival instinct. "I'm a nurse. I can monitor him. I can administer medication under a doctor's order, but I can't make diagnostic decisions." "You will have anything you need," the man replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "My doctors will follow your instructions. You saw something they did not. That makes you the most qualified person in this room." He looked from Zara to the nervous doctor, and the unspoken threat was clear. Her authority here was absolute because he willed it. For the next several hours, Zara worked. She slipped back into the familiar rhythms of her job, the fear pushed to the back of her mind by the sheer force of habit and the immediate needs of her patient. She checked Mr. Kim's vitals, adjusted his 4-drip, and drew blood to monitor his enzyme levels. She spoke in low, clear tones to the other doctor, who quickly deferred to her obvious competence. The man who brought her here, she learned his name was Kwon Jihan, did not leave. He stood in the corner of the room, a silent, watchful sentinel, his presence a constant pressure at the edge of her awareness. At one point, Mr. Kim's body began to shudder. A violent seizure. The monitor shrieked as his heart rate spiked erratically. The other doctor panicked, reaching for a sedative.
"No."
Zara snapped, her voice sharp with command. It'll depress his respiratory system. It's a neuroresponse. We need to ride it out. Get me a cooling blanket and prepare a magnesium drip. She worked quickly, moving around the bed with an efficiency that was mesmerizing. She protected Mr. Kim's head, spoke to him in a low, calming voice, and managed his vitals through the worst of it. The seizure subsided as quickly as it had begun, leaving him limp and drenched in sweat. The room was silent save for the steady, rhythmic beep of the restored heart monitor. Zara finally allowed herself to breathe, her forehead damp with her own sweat. She turned and found Jihan's eyes on her. He had not moved from his corner, but the intensity in his gaze was palpable. He had seen her in her element, seen her confidence, her unflinching nerve under pressure. Later, after Mr. Kim was stable and sleeping, Zara stood by the massive window, looking down at the city she could no longer access. She felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if she were an astronaut gazing at a world she had left behind. She heard a soft sound behind her. Jihan was there, holding a steaming mug. He didn't speak, just extended it to her. She took it, her cold fingers wrapping around the warmth of the ceramic. It was tea, a fragrant, calming chamomile. The simple, domestic gesture was so at odds with the violence and danger that surrounded him that it felt like a glitch in reality. "I have lost people I was sworn to protect before," he said, his voice quiet, directed at the glass. "Men who trusted me. A woman who believed I could keep her safe. I failed them. It will not happen again." Zara said nothing. She simply held the warm mug, the steam caressing her face. His wound, she realized. He was not just trying to save his soldier. He was trying to exorcise a ghost. An adult woman he had failed. The admission hung in the air between them, a rare and fragile thing. He was showing her a piece of himself, a shard of vulnerability he likely showed no one. He saw her not just as a tool, but as a witness. And in his world, a witness was either a liability to be eliminated or an asset to be bound to him. She had a terrifying feeling she was rapidly becoming the latter. The days bled into one another, marked not by the sun but by the rhythmic beeping of the monitors and the quiet, tense atmosphere of the glass house. Zara fell into a routine dictated by Mr. Kim's recovery. She was a prisoner, but a gilded one. She had a luxurious guest suite with a bed softer than any she had ever slept in and a bathroom stocked with expensive products. Meals appeared outside her door on a tray, always delicious, always silent. But the doors were guarded, and the panoramic windows did not open. She saw Kwon Jihan intermittently. He would appear in the doorway of the medical room, a silent observer in his perfect suit, his presence shifting the gravity of the space. He rarely spoke to her, but she felt his eyes on her constantly. It was an unnerving, intimate scrutiny. He watched the way her hands moved with deft precision, the way she bit her lip when studying a chart, the exhaustion that settled in the lines around her eyes late at night. She, in turn, began to notice things about him. The way he held his shoulders, carrying an invisible weight. The single, faint scar that bisected his left eyebrow, a flaw in his otherwise perfect mask. The way his hand would clench into a fist for a bare second when he received bad news over the phone, the only sign of emotion he allowed himself. One evening, Mr. Kim was finally well enough to be moved from the bed to a chair. It was a small victory, but in the oppressive quiet of the house, it felt monumental. Zara was helping him sip some broth when the house alarm went off. It wasn't a loud, blaring siren, but a series of low, urgent chimes that sounded through the walls, a gentleman's warning of imminent death. Jihan was in the room in an instant, his two main guards with him. He was no longer the calm businessman. His face was a mask of cold fury, his body thrumming with lethal energy. "Get her out of here," he commanded one of the guards, gesturing to Zara. "Take her to the safe room." Before the guard could move, the massive window overlooking the city exploded inward, showering the room in a cascade of glittering, deadly shards. Two figures in black tactical gear rappelled through the gaping hole, landing in silent rolls on the floor, guns already raised. Everything happened in a blur of motion. Jihan moved with a speed that was inhuman. He shoved the table at the first intruder, sending hot broth and porcelain flying, and in the same motion, drew a handgun from a holster Zara had never known he wore. The sound of the gunshot was shockingly loud in the enclosed space, a flat, brutal crack. The first man went down. The second intruder pivoted, his weapon swinging toward Zara. She was frozen. The bowl dropped from her hands, her mind screaming but her body locked in place. In that split second, Jihan crossed the room. He didn't push her out of the way. He became a shield, his body slamming into hers, driving her back and down, away from the line of fire. They hit the floor hard, Zara cushioned by a solid frame. His arm was wrapped around her, his hand protectively covering her head as glass rained down around them. She could feel the frantic beat of his heart against her back, or maybe it was her own. The scent of his cedarwood cologne was mixed with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Another shot rang out, this one from Jihan's guard, and the second intruder fell. It was over in less than 10 seconds. Silence descended, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the distant city hum filtering through the shattered window and Zara's own ragged breathing. Jihan remained over her for a long moment, a dead weight of muscle and tailored wool. His breath was hot against her ear. Then he shifted, pushing himself up. He looked down at her, his dark eyes sweeping over her, checking for injuries. The cold mask was gone. In its place was something raw and unguarded, a possessive fury so potent it made the air crackle. He had almost lost her. The realization hit Zara with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just protecting an asset. He was protecting her. He stood and extended a hand, pulling her to her feet. His grip was tight, his knuckles white. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a low growl. Zara shook her head, unable to speak. His eyes flickered to the captured assassin his men were now securing. The man was wounded but alive. Jihan's face hardened, the brief flicker of emotion vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. He walked over to the man, his movements precise and deadly. He needed information. Who sent them? How did they find this location? The assassin just spat blood on the floor and laughed. Jihan's expression didn't change, but a new, more terrifying coldness entered his eyes. He looked at his men, then at the assassin, a silent battle of wills playing out. They had methods, Zara was sure of it, but they might not have time. Another team could be on its way. And that's when Zara heard her own voice, low and steady, cutting through the tension. "He won't talk," she said, her gaze on the assassin's defiant sneer. "Not if you just try to break his bones." Jihan turned to look at her, his head tilted in a silent question. Zara took a step forward, her fear replaced by a cold, clinical focus. The world had narrowed to this room, this threat. Survival. Pain is a tool. "You're using a sledgehammer when you need a scalpel." She looked at the man on the floor, at the way his arm was twisted. Her medical knowledge, a tool for healing, suddenly presented itself as its opposite. "The brachial plexus," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's a network of nerves between the neck and the shoulder. A precise, non-damaging pressure applied there will cause a level of agony that will bypass his tolerance. He'll tell you whatever you want to know just to make it stop." Silence. The guard stared at her. Jihan's eyes bored into hers, searching, assessing. She had just offered him a piece of her soul, the dark underside of her life-saving knowledge. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. She was no longer just a nurse caught in the crossfire. She was a participant, a strategist. Jihan gave a slow, deliberate nod to one of his men. The man knelt, and a moment later, a choked, guttural scream tore from the assassin's throat, a sound that was cut off as soon as it began. Later, after the mess was cleaned up and the window temporarily boarded over, Jihan found her in her room. She was standing in the dark, her arms wrapped around herself, shaking. He didn't turn on the light. He just stood in the doorway, a tall shadow against the hall light. "You see the world as it is," he said, his voice soft in the darkness. "Not as it should be. I have not met anyone like that in a long time." It wasn't a compliment. It wasn't an absolution. It was a confession of recognition. He was telling her that he saw her, the part of her that knew how to survive, the part that had just taught his men how to torture. He saw it because it was a reflection of himself. And in that dark, quiet room, that felt more intimate, more dangerous, than any declaration of love could ever be, the distance between them had collapsed. They were no longer captor and captive. They were two sides of the same tarnished coin.